Hello, welcome. On behalf of the Institute of Politics and our partners on this event, the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, a great new asset on our campus, I welcome you. I'm particularly enthused about this discussion because I am the son of a refugee. My father came over here from Eastern Europe when he was a boy, driven out by violence and persecution, and this country opened its arms to him and made everything possible for me. Today, we are facing a global crisis, a humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis as a result of conflict and war and famine in many different parts of the world. And our guest is as active and important in trying to address that crisis as anyone I know. So we welcome him. I will not do the formal introduction, but what I do want to tell you is that we will open the floor to take questions. Raise your hands. Dr. Robinson will call on you, and one of our students will pass you a microphone. As usual, we're going to prioritize the first three questions to be asked by students. And I just want to remind you what you, I think, already know, which is that question marks and questions end with question marks. Speeches do not. So please put a question mark at the end of your question. And I ask that you make sure that your phones are silent. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Afreen Ahmed, a third-year student from Chicago studying economics and comparative race and ethnic studies. She is the events chair of the Leaders of Color organization at the Institute of Politics. Please join me in welcoming Afreen to the podium.
In a time when the entire institution of refugee resettlement in America is uncertain, global crises are unrelenting in their displacement of millions of people. The UNHCR estimates that 17 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes in 2016 alone. But as displacement numbers reach record highs, the volume of refugee arrivals in the United States is decreasing. The new 2018 fiscal year brings a ceiling of 45,000 refugee arrivals through the annual presidential determination, down from 110,000 arrivals under President Obama last year. As debate continues over America's responsibility to assist refugees, this conversation today is more important and timely than ever. We are glad to welcome the Honorable David Miliband, who is President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, where he oversees the agency's humanitarian relief operations in more than 40 war-affected countries, as well as the IRC's refugee resettlement and assistance programs in 28 United States cities. From 2007 to 2010, Miliband was the 74th Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Kingdom, where he progressed human rights and represented the UK around the world. And before that, he served as Secretary of State for the Environment, establishing climate change as a policy priority, and as Member of Parliament for South Shields for over a decade, and as an analyst at the Institute for Public Policy Research. Miliband's parents fled to Britain from continental Europe during World War II and its aftermath. As the son of refugees, he brings a personal commitment to the IRC's work, and I am honored to introduce him to a conversation entitled Human Rights in Crisis: War, Famine, and Refugees. Please join me in welcoming David Miliband.
Thank you. So the way this is going to go is I give a little introduction, and we're going to have a conversation, then we open it up. So when I was thinking about what I was going to say and how could we start thinking about these issues, I'd like to say that I think this issue of refugees and migrants, it's intrinsic to the way humans are. The way a lot of psychologists and biologists think about humanity. Why is it that humans are so successful relative to other primates or other species? It's because we're very good at cooperating with strangers. We're very good at cooperating with people who we're not genetically related to. And that's the whole history of humanity. Humans have moved around, and they become very successful because they've organized societies at big scale. So the problem of cooperating with people and trusting people and welcoming other people into our societies and building heterogeneous and different societies with strangers, and this is the whole history of humanity. And the reason humans have been so successful is they found ways of doing that, whether that's through the invention of language or institutional innovation, ideas of fictive kinship, institutional innovation in the modern world. And this problem has just got bigger and bigger and bigger over history. But it's a very old problem. I think, we were mentioning that Mr. Miliband's parents came fleeing persecution in the 1940s from Eastern Europe. But the Robinsons, after all, where did the Robinsons? The Robinsons, that's a Scandinavian name. 1,000 years ago, the Robinsons ended up in England from Scandinavia. Maybe they were there pillaging, but they might have, they might also have been fleeing poverty and violence. And if you think about the work of Steven Pinker, for example, we know that violence was actually worse historically than it is today, according to some normalizations. So there was a lot of violence and conflict historically, including in Scandinavia, and a lot of people were fleeing violence and conflict historically as well, moving around the world. So this is just an intrinsic part of humanity, and the success of humanity has been, we've been able to come up with ways of solving this problem and flourishing in the context of this, not as a problem, but as a huge advantage of humanity. So I think this is an set of issues which are just intrinsic to humanity and the history of humanity, and how we deal with these issues is critical for the future of humanity and the health of humanity. So after that grand pretentious introduction, probably...
I knew we were dealing with big issues, but this has just gone sort of way beyond...
Let me ask about, let me start by, you're not here to listen to me talk, you're here to listen to him talk. So I thought, I should start by just, raising the issue that probably is in everyone's mind today, which is, how does the current policies of the government, this restriction on the admission of refugees into the United States, the travel ban, which may or may not be about to go into operation, the general kind of antagonistic attitude towards migration that's now sort of emerged in the United States, that has led some of the very old green card holders to recently file for citizenship after all of these years. How do you think of the consequences of that for the United States? Why should the United States be admitting these people? And what are the consequences of not admitting them?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. One of the first things I was always taught at university is always to attack the question. So I'm not going to answer that question in quite the direct way, because the US is only a part player in this wider question. I think you can only understand the role of the United States if you understand the nature of the challenge that we're facing. For me, we are not living through a migration crisis. I think that's a misnomer. But we are living through a refugee crisis. And it's important to understand the distinction between them. More or less 200, 220 million people are crossing borders in search of a better life, to improve their economic prospects. 25 million people are being forced to cross borders to save their lives. And I think there is a category difference between someone who is a baker in Damascus, whose bakery is bombed by Assad, who then goes to Jordan, a girl who is in northeast Nigeria who's doing her studies and gets chased out of her country by Boko Haram, a Rohingya Muslim in Myanmar whose village is burnt and crosses into Bangladesh. There is a category difference between those people for whom it's not safe to go home and people who are choosing to come to another country in search of, or to take up, an alternative lifestyle. I mean, I'm one of those people. I'm a British citizen who's living and working in the United States. And the importance of understanding the integrity and defending the integrity and the definition of a refugee is that for hundreds of years that you refer to, these people didn't count. The victims of war and persecution had no rights at all. But since 1948, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, since 1951, the UN Convention on Refugees, those people are counted, they do have rights, and states have responsibilities towards them. And it is the retreat of states, not just Western states, in fulfilling those responsibilities and honoring those rights that constitutes the crisis that we're facing today. And that's the context in which to understand the decisions of the Trump administration, both in respect of international overseas aid, where it's proposing a 30% cut in not just overseas aid, but in the number of diplomats it supports, and a halving of the number of refugees who are allowed to come here. And so the question of the entry into the US is a subset of a wider set of questions. Obviously, I would argue that it's damaging for the US and damaging globally for the world's largest refugee resettlement country, the US, to halve the number of refugees who are allowed to come here. I think it's damaging morally, but it's also damaging strategically and damaging in substantive terms for the people who are affected. It also threatens a domino effect because Uganda has welcomed 1 million refugees in the last year from South Sudan. Pakistan has 2.5 million refugees from Afghanistan. Iran actually has 900,000 refugees from Afghanistan as well. And so there's a danger of a domino effect. But there's also the fact that refugees, far from being a burden to the US, have actually been one of the most successful imports into the US. From Albert Einstein, who founded the International Rescue Committee, Andy Grove, who's invented the Intel microchip that's in every computer that you use. He was resettled by the IRC to New York from Hungary in 1956. We bought him his first hearing aid. He'd had scarlet fever as a child and couldn't hear properly, and we bought him his hearing aid that allowed him to pursue an education. To Madeleine Albright and Sergey Brin. These are people who have brought tremendous benefit to this country. So my reflection, sorry for the long-winded answer, my reflection is that this is both a mistake that's being made, but it's also a tragedy that a country that has benefited so much from being a place of haven and a place of safety should be turning its back on those people. And it's both a commentary on the state of political discourse in the country and a substantive harm to the people who are being affected that policy should have gone so badly wrong.
But do you think that distinction is important, though? I mean, from the point of view of American policymakers, you make this very clear distinction between people like you or me, who came here to fulfill, to follow a career path or whatever, and other people who were forced from their homes. At the end of the day, we both end up in the United. I just wonder if that distinction is kind of important for policymakers. I
think it's very important because and I don't just mean it's legally important, because obviously there's no legal requirement on any country to have an immigration policy that allows people to come in. I mean, Japan famously has refused to have immigrants come into the country. One can agree with that or disagree with that, but that's a choice they have. But by being a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, a state says that it will honor the commitment not to send someone back to a place that's dangerous. But I don't think there's just a legal distinction. I also think that if you want to hold popular support both for refugees and for immigrants, you have to maintain the distinction. And my argument would be that the way in which refugees and immigrants have been demonized in parts of the US debate is because of a confusion between the two. And it's not that one is good and the other is bad, it's that they're different. And so the fact that in the same sentence President Trump can say Syrian refugees are a Trojan horse and are a threat to your family, and that undocumented, quote-unquote, migrants are an economic threat to you, that confusion is, I think, one of the sources of the leverage that he's got on that issue.
I see.
So I think there's a political reason as well as a moral and legal reason to sustain the difference. I mean, if you think about it, if you sign up for open borders, you're never going to win popular support on that basis, because people want to have markets managed. They don't want to have them left free. If you say we're going to manage our migration system, and as part of that we're going to have the following set of policies towards refugees, I think you've got a chance of winning the argument.
But what are the consequences apart from that? So you're identifying, negative consequences for the United States in the sense that historically the US has benefited immensely from this ability to kind of absorb people from all over the world. They've been able to use their talents and skills, and those people, they might be people like you or me, or they might be people who have come as refugees from crisis situations. They didn't want to come, to get a job. They came because they were pushed, but they all come and they get absorbed. But are there consequences more broadly for the US's ability to kind of solve global problems or exert its influence globally by this attitude, do you think?
I mean, look, if the US was retreating from its commitments to refugees, but engaging globally on climate change and a host of other issues, then you could say, well, there's limited impact. But obviously, there's a wider syndrome here. And all Western countries are having a debate about whether or not they can sustain engagement with the wider world and meet their commitments to their own populations at the same time. Now, I think that is possible, and I think that is a political argument you can win, but it's not an easy one to win. I don't deny that. What I would also argue, though, is that as the US withdraws from its commitments, it does set in train this domino effect. So it's easier to imagine that, it's not just Western countries that are having this debate. Kenya is having this debate. Pakistan is having the debate. Uganda, remarkably, is not having the debate, despite the fact that 1 million refugees have come. There seems to be, I was in Uganda in June, meeting people both at the border where the 1 million refugees have come from South Sudan and in Kampala, where there are refugees from South Sudan, but also Congo and elsewhere. A remarkable sense that these people are our brothers and sisters and we have to continue to welcome them. But I think that when the US resiles on its commitments, then that does invite a domino effect. Now, it's interesting, if you follow the debates in the European Parliament at the moment, last week they passed a piece of legislation in respect of refugee resettlement into Europe. One of the biggest arguments for a higher number of refugees to be allowed in Europe was precisely that the US was going backwards, so Europe had to step forward. And actually, there is a slight paradox that notwithstanding the Austrian election, there's quite a lot of evidence that the attitudes of the US administration have been quite a galvanizing force for alternative politics in Europe, from, I suppose, more broadly what you describe as more progressive positions. But my reflection is that this refugee issue, in a way, is a harbinger for the fate of globalization more generally. When the world resiles on its commitments to refugees, it's a stepping stone to resiling on a wider set of commitments. And if we can't hold the line at the baker from Damascus who's been bombed out of their house, the girl who's been driven from her school by Boko Haram, if you can't draw the line at those cases, then we're going to end up losing a wider set of arguments too, whether about climate or a range of other issues.
Yeah, that reminds me of the famous argument, I don't remember the person who made this, about Germany in the 1930s, that when they came for the communists, I didn't do anything because I wasn't a communist, or when they came for the unionists, I didn't do anything because I wasn't a member of a union, and when they came for me, there was no one left to help me. I don't remember who said that, but it's a famous saying about the Holocaust. So many issues are interlinked like that, so then there's a once you start down a slippery slope, you get many. That's a good reason for creating solidarity around this issue. That's what you're saying. Many things.
Yeah, but I think I'm also saying that globalization has become so unequal, so unstable, and so insecure that it's become a whipping boy for its own failings. And there's undoubtedly a political market in saying that, not that globalization needs to be made fairer, more secure, and more sustainable. There's undoubtedly a political market for saying we need to go back on globalization.
And it's become insecure, why? Because of the impact on inequality, or?
I think partly because of that, but it's also that the institutions of global government are not too strong, as many of those who are so-called populist would argue, but because they're too weak. I mean, the refugee case is not a case where the United Nations High Commission on Refugees is too strong and too interventionist in what it's doing. It's too slow and too reactive in what it's doing. And I think that we're stuck in this halfway house. I mean, this is not really my current job. This is really my previous life. But we're stuck in this position at the moment where, if you think about it historically, the world has been governed either by a hegemonic and activist global power, or by the balance of power, or by sharing of sovereignty. Those are only, logically, if you think about it, those are three ways in which the world can be governed. This isn't an age of empires. It's not an age of the balance of power. It's not like the Cold War. And the sharing of sovereignty, which some of us thought was going to make quite a lot of strides forward in the last 15 years, has not. I mean, the European Union has not collapsed, but the mimicking of it that we anticipated might happen in other parts of the world is at best nascent. And so I think that when people talk about an ungoverned space, they're often thinking of a part of Afghanistan or a part of Somalia. The ungoverned space is actually the global commons. Maybe undergoverned would be a better word than ungoverned. And the refugee issue is an example of that. It's actually a soluble political problem because almost by definition, a refugee has moved from somewhere dangerous to somewhere peaceful. I mean, it's much harder to figure out how do you protect people's lives in Aleppo or in Idlib at the moment than it is to figure out how do you educate them once they've made it to Lebanon or to Jordan. Yeah. I mean, it's a pretty conventional public policy problem to educate someone who's fled into a neighbouring country that is itself peaceful. It's a difficult problem, but it's not an insoluble problem.
Yeah, so perhaps we should talk a bit about that since that was more your previous life. So one of the things that you've been doing in the IRC, I guess, is to try to promote knowledge-based research about how to deal with these refugee problems and the kind of life crises. How do you help people move on? How do you help people deal with these problems? And so could you say a little bit about what you've learnt about, someone flees from Syria, they end up in Lebanon. What's the priority? What do we know about what you can do to help them?
Well, so for those of you who don't know, the International Rescue Committee is an international humanitarian aid organization. We work in 196 field sites around the world, 30 or so countries. We're multi-mandated, so we do health, water and sanitation, education, employment, protection of women and girls, women and kids. And we work in 26 US cities resettling refugees here, so that's what the organization does. The two facts that I think are most important in understanding the future of humanitarian action are, one, that the average duration of displacement for a refugee is 10 years, and that once you've been displaced for 5 years, the average duration is 21 years. So this is a long-term problem, not a short-term problem. The 10-year figure I find very hard to believe as an average because actually less than 1% of the world's refugees went home last year. So if you actually do the maths, it doesn't compute properly. So the first point is long-term displacement. And the second point is that the assumption is that a refugee is someone who's being housed in a refugee camp until they go home. But actually 60% of the world's refugees are in urban areas, not in camps. So fact number two is that this is an urban experience in which people are part of the market economy, not separated from the market economy. And in a camp, you're provided with shelter and you're provided with food. In an urban environment, obviously those things are not provided for you. So when you say, what have I learned? I've learned things about how do you develop long-term solutions for people who are in part of our society, not separate from our society. And what do you learn? Well, the obvious thing that people need if they're a refugee is money. I mean, it's not very complicated. If you're in a market economy and you haven't got any money, then you're stuck. So the most effective humanitarian intervention is to give people cash, not literally dollar bills necessarily, but to give them financial support because it's empowering for them, it contributes to the local economy, and it's a powerful force for them. Second thing that really matters is whether or not they're allowed to work. In those countries like Uganda where they're allowed to work, there's this extraordinary study in Kampala in 2014, not unfortunately done by the IRC, but by someone else, that Oxford Refugee Studies Centre, that 97%, an enormous percentage of the refugees in Kampala had no need of humanitarian aid because they were able to support themselves. So work is, and in most countries that refugees are in, they're not allowed to work, which of course drives, they do work, but in the underground economy, and that creates its own syndromes and difficulties. The third thing that I've learned is so appalling that it makes you want to bang your head against the wall. More or less half of refugees are kids. yet less than 2% of global humanitarian funding is on education. So you've got this total crisis of support for the generations that are being born. When I went to the what was then the world's largest refugee camp, it's called Dadaab in eastern Kenya. It was home at the time to 340,000 Somalis. I asked this woman, what do you think you'll ever go back to Somalia? And she looked at me and she said, what do you mean go back to Somalia? I was born here. And of the 340,000 people living in the camp, 100,000 had been born in the camp. But less than 2% of the global humanitarian budget goes on education, which is completely crazy. I mean, the European Union, to be fair, has said that it's now got a target that 8% of its budget is going to go on education, but it's still 8%, which is only the beginnings of a dent in this. And that's all the more dangerous because actually the research evidence is that if you give people proper nurturing care, you can actually reverse the trauma that they've suffered. So the third thing I've learned is that. The fourth thing I've learned, finally, just to keep the conversation going, is the resilience of these people is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the determination to make sure that the next generation will get an opportunity, that's what drove people in the end to risk their lives to get to Europe. And I think that in countries where refugees are given a chance to contribute, they make an entrepreneurial contribution of a quite extraordinary kind.
Yeah. So the remark about children suggests, the burden of this falls very unequally on different people in society, on children and women, or like old people, or what? Are there other things to learn about that?
Well, the most important thing is that, and I should have said this, the top 10 refugee hosting countries account for 2.5% of global income. So the quote-unquote burden of refugee hosting is faced by countries that are poor, not by countries that are rich. And so when people talk, if you go to the Middle East and you talk about the European refugee crisis, they'll really give you a slap because they'll say, look, the fact that the issue became a big story in the media when it landed in Europe doesn't mean it wasn't a massive story in the Middle East before then. 5.5 million refugees from Syria became a media story when 1 million of them arrived in Europe. And so the fact that it's lower middle income countries who are bearing the greatest share of the burden is, I think, the biggest part of this story. And I mean, we can go into it if you like, but in a way, the Syrian refugee who's got an education in Syria and becomes a refugee in Jordan is the middle class end of the spectrum. If you think about the countries that are in the main spilling out refugees, Somalia, Afghanistan, Congo, South Sudan, Myanmar, those are lower down the global income spectrum without the kind of primary education systems or others that you might expect in somewhere like Syria.
But when we started talking, you were mentioning a lot the responsibilities of the US as a consequence of having ratified these treaties. But if these people are in Lebanon, do we have any responsibilities for them? Do we have any responsibilities for the Lebanese government, or is it only is that?
Well, I think it's a good question to ask, but I would argue that we do have a responsibility for a couple of reasons. One, if you see someone else in need and are able to help them but don't, then shame on you. I mean, there's a moral argument which I don't think we should be afraid to mention even in an institution of rationality and logic like this. We can still hold... We can still hold... Oh, yeah, philosophers, okay, but are they not logical and rational?
Oh, they are, but they can be ethical too.
There are reasons of ethics why we should care, but I mean, there's an argument about this. You can say, look, humanitarians should only play the ethical card, because if you play the strategic card, it's dangerous. I'm not inhibited in playing the strategic card. The strategic card says, if Lebanon collapses under the weight of the refugees, it will affect allies of the US and effectively, ultimately affect the US itself. Secondly, the second strategic aspect of this is that if the US is perceived, in this case, to be turning its back on Muslim refugees, that has its own narrative and dynamic associated with it that's dangerous. Thirdly, humanitarian aid cannot make up for foreign policy mistakes, but when foreign policy mistakes are made, Iraq being an obvious example, then there is some responsibility, to use your word, to make good on the failure. But fourthly, I think there is this argument, and I haven't completely worked it through, but when the Convention on Refugees was written, It brought together all the countries of the world after the UN Convention, but it was driven from the West. But nonetheless, there were capitalist countries and communist countries. There were democratic countries and autocratic countries. But written in were individual rights, freedoms of religion, thought, conscience, etc. And those are individual rights that are not upheld in dictatorships. But almost by definition, they do not respect those rights. And Western countries have, I think, a responsibility to uphold those rights. That's not just legal, but there's also the essence of what they are. Because if the persecuted Rohingya in Myanmar or the dissident in Russia or in Cuba cannot look to a Western pluralist democracy as a place that will offer them refuge, then we have abandoned our own moral high ground in a very dangerous way. And so I think there are strategic reasons as well as moral reasons for thinking it's important that we live by our commitments.
Yeah. So you mentioned Myanmar. That's a very interesting case in terms of thinking about the politics of refugees and also about the interface between the politics of refugees and the international institutions like the United Nations. Could you reflect a little on what's gone wrong in Myanmar?
I mean, I'm not an expert on the country at all, so it's important to have a degree of humility. There may be someone here who's from Myanmar or who knows it well. I was there last November. I mean, it's obviously, most problems go back to the office I used to hold, which, of course, Britain has its own fair share of history in respect of what we used to call Burma and is now called Myanmar. But it's obviously historically been a very divided country, and for the last 40 years it's been a military dictatorship. And so when you say what's gone wrong, at one level it's obvious what's gone wrong. There's been a failure to defend the rights of people who look to the state to defend them from violence, and in fact they've been the object of violence with the connivance of the state. When you look deeper, you realize that large parts of the state and large parts of the Myanmar population denied that these Rohingya were ever citizens. And it's a very core question. And tragically, they were denied rights from the Bangladesh side as well, who have historically not been willing to let them in. But essentially, there's been a breakdown in the contract between residents, if not citizens of that country, actually a breakdown in the contract between citizens of that country and their government. And the international community has stood on the side and not been able to affect it. Now, the deeper question, I think, is whether or not it's feasible to envision a different kind of future for Myanmar, because the future that's beckoning at the moment is tragically one in which this whole community is driven out of the country. Half the Muslim minority population have been driven out of Myanmar. I think many people would be very questioning of whether the 500,000 who left will ever be allowed back. And so the question then becomes, who's going to defend the right of the 500,000 who remain not to be driven out themselves? And that seems to me to be the immediate and pressing question beyond the humanitarian aid that we're trying to do in Bangladesh. And frankly, we've got humanitarian aid workers in Rakhine State who are not being allowed to do their jobs because they're not being given permission to go to the parts of the state where the Muslim minority are. We deliver healthcare for about 120,000 people in that state, and we're not being allowed to do our work at the moment by the government.
Okay, so I think we're going to open it up now to the floor. We have some travelling microphones. Who wants to break the ice?
I'll just speak up, okay?
Okay, well, yeah, I think it's better than everyone can hear. So we can hear, but it's coming.
Oh, sorry. All right, so one thing you mentioned was that the crisis today mainly has to do with states not protecting refugees' rights. So my question is, for example, if you have a refugee who's fleeing from Syria to Lebanon, which of those states basically has the duty to uphold the rights of those refugees? Is it both? Is it neither? Do they have different duties to those refugees?
I mean,
Yeah.
essentially Lebanon does. I mean, it's complicated because not all states to which refugees flee are parties to the UN Convention. So if you're not a signatory, and Syria is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, but if you're not a signatory to the convention, then technically you're not bound by it. So for example, the refugees who've gone into Bangladesh, Bangladesh is not a signatory, and Bangladesh doesn't want to give them the status of quote-unquote refugees, even though it's allowing them to be there. If you think about, people often say to me, well, what about the Gulf countries? Shouldn't they be taking more Syrians? Which is a good point. They're not signatories to the Refugee Convention. So if you Google how many refugees in Saudi Arabia, it will say 0. If you Google how many Syrians in Saudi Arabia, it'll say 120,000, because they've been admitted as migrants, not as refugees, and so they haven't been given protection under the convention. But essentially, in answer to your question, it is the state that has a responsibility. If they're not a signatory, then the United Nations High Commission on Refugees has a responsibility towards them.
Man,
Have we got the mic
microphone
for you? They're very keen to preserve your words for history and posterity.
yes.
There you go.
I think
So you were discussing at the beginning the distinction between migrants and refugees and the importance thereof. Is there a space, do you think, or how can this framework accommodate, I guess there's kind of quote unquote economic refugees in a lot of migration literature now. So for example, someone in a country that does not have an economic framework that can provide them with the means to a decent life, are they then a refugee with indirect coercion, or would that still be a migrant in this framework?
Well, look, that is a great question. And what I've learned in 4 years in the United States is that when people say that's a great question, they basically don't know the answer to the question, which more or less describes the situation today. Just to nitpick a little bit, just to maybe reframe your question in a way that does speak to a genuine grey area. Because you referred to an economic refugee. There's not really any such thing as an economic refugee, because the thing to keep in your head is a refugee is someone who cannot safely return home. But just to slightly reframe it, what happens if you're fleeing famine in a country and you're driven from your home by famine? For the sake of argument, climate change has affected the crop production. There's no state provision, and it's for that reason that you've crossed a border. It's hard to say that person can go back. That it's also hard to say that it was a voluntary move. And so there are some grey areas. And what's happened over the last 70 years, 65 years, is that a series of court judgments and then the implementation of the UN Convention in different international law has given a series of case histories as to, well, what counts as a refugee and what doesn't count as a refugee. I think it's important to keep the integrity of the idea that a refugee is someone who can't safely return home. That's one reason I slightly, not just slightly, I think this issue of the quote-unquote climate refugee needs to be thought of rather carefully. There are many people, there's no question that climate change is both happening and driving people to move. It's not necessarily driving people to leave the country that they're in. And so I think that, obviously, I understand that climate change is real and it's a contributor to displacement. But in thinking through the rights and responsibilities of states, I just think we've got to be careful in figuring out what is a global problem that needs a global solution and what is a legal right that can be enforced against a state or against an international institution. And so I think there are grey areas. I mean, the famine case is a very, very difficult grey area. There's also, to be honest, there's quite a difficult grey area if you think about the person who flees to Jordan is a refugee who then flees to Europe. Because you can't really say, well, they weren't safe in Jordan. So I'm not trying to argue against myself, I'm just trying to show that there's a complexity and texture to the issue. Now, home for them was Syria, and they can't return home to Syria. But what happens if they were actually not born in Syria? What happens if they were born in Jordan? Well, they're a refugee, but that definition of whether or not it's safe for them to return home, when does it become home that you've been living in the country for a certain period of time? Now, there is a system of adjudication to try and work that through. That's why I don't want to deny that there aren't grey areas and difficult questions. But I think the fundamental point that there's a difference between someone who's bombed in their bakery in Damascus and someone who chooses to move from London to New York, those are the polar cases, and I think it's important to hold on to the integrity of that definition of a refugee. Otherwise, we're on a very difficult slide, because what we'll find is not that there are more rights for migrants, we'll find there are fewer rights for refugees.
How can you apply that framework that you're sort of talking about to some of the issues that the U.S. is facing with people who are fleeing from Central America, Mexico, and the Northern Triangle? And looking at that where it's maybe unsafe for them to go home because they face gang violence or issues of economic poverty that have caused that situation where it's unsafe to return home, but you don't want to call them economic refugees. And because the U.S. is unwilling to call them refugees, they don't get to enter into that system that allows them to ask for safety in the U.S. because they're fleeing from something they fear.
Well, that is also a great question. My view is that if you're fleeing gang violence, you are a refugee, actually. And funnily enough, ironically, we've got an assessment team in El Salvador at the moment, precisely for this reason. When the flow of unaccompanied minors in 2015 came through, we were clear that those were refugees, those kids who were fleeing, because it wasn't safe for them to go home. And I think you're absolutely right to raise it. It's that gang violence, which I'm not sure it has economic roots, but it has a range of, it's not a traditional civil war. It's obviously different from the conditions in which refugee status was originally created and conceived. But I think it's undeniable that those people are suffering from the same kind of fear for their lives that drives people from Syria or elsewhere. And that's why I would argue that they should be given refugee status. And actually, those who do make it through the US court system, there's a massive backlog, but those who do make it through actually do get the adjudications are often in their favor. Rightly, in my view.
So you did mention that 60% of your refugees are living in urban environments, and you did mention that you do have generations of refugees coming through now. And I know that's considered a gray area, but has there been any policy that's been written for where does that person see home if they were never born in the place that they're seeking refugee status under?
Obviously the most controversial aspect of this is something which we probably don't want to get into because it will take up the rest of the day. But obviously the most famous example would be Palestinian refugees who've not given up their desire to quote unquote return home. That's the most contested example of that, and that applies across generations, not just to those from 1947. I think that it's interesting in the case of, the most sort of the tightest and quote unquote easiest case were the refugees from the Balkans in the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, about half of whom did return home in the end, actually. But to the extent, if your question is, well, when do they get to call a new country home, the answer is when that new country grants them citizenship. And the tragedy for many of the Palestinian refugees is that even if they're in other Arab countries, they're not actually given citizenship, which is all part of a fiction of whether or not, of what their status is. Interestingly, a lot of another grey area is about the stateless position of the children who are born, for example, to Somali parents in Kenya, because they're not given Kenyan citizenship either. If you look at what's happening in Turkey at the moment, President Erdogan is saying that he's interested in giving citizenship to some of the Syrians, he rather wants them to vote in Turkish elections. So there's quite a lot of, there's a lot of politics in it. Obviously, in the US, if you're a refugee resettled here after a year, you can get a green card, and after 5 years, you can become a citizen. And one thing I haven't said, and it's maybe worth saying it, is that the numbers who are resettled into Western countries are relatively small, but the symbolic value is quite high. So if you're the king of Jordan, who's telling his own population, look, we've got to put up with 650,000 registered refugees, and you can say, well, look, and the US is taking, we would argue, 110,000 a year. That's a symbolic stand with countries that are on the receiving end. If your own population is saying, yeah, but the richest countries in the world, I mean, it's extraordinary that in Uganda they don't say this. In Uganda, the average income, I was told when I was there in June, is $952 per person per year. You're inviting a pushback, really, from people who can say, well, hang on, the US has average income of $57,000 a year. Why are they not taking more refugees? But the simple fact is that in the US, it's a 5-year journey.
But I think that's something to do. Isn't that something to do with the different nature of identities in Africa compared to other parts of the world? I mean, in Africa, you have many ethnic groups that straddle borders, that speak the same language on different sides of the border, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know any research on this, but it seems like it might be that there's just a different notion of what Ugandan means, you know, as opposed to what English means. Or...
Yeah, I mean, my anecdotal report would be that actually a much bigger driver is less an ethnic identity than Ugandans saying, hang on, we were refugees 30 years ago, 40 years ago from Idi Amin, and neighboring countries looked after us, and so it's right that we look after them when people come into our country. So it was less of an, anecdotally, less an ethnic than a historical experience, the question of a historical experience.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to investigate, I think.
I'll try and run through a load of questions.
Sir,
I was wondering if you could go back to the comment you made about the role of Gulf countries, because just given regional proximity and their higher wealth status, I'm curious about your thoughts on the role they play or should play, even regardless of whether or not they've signed the UN treaty.
Look, they're developed economies, and they should be both international humanitarian aid donors through the multilateral system, and they should be welcoming refugees into their own countries. I feel that strongly. Now, they would say in return they are big aid donors, although they're often aid donors through their own organizations rather than through the multilateral system. But that would be my answer.
2 minutes, okay.
So you mentioned that in Europe there's been sort of a reaction to the reaction, in some sense a favorable reaction, but in many European countries there is some decentralized nationalist sentiment. For example, in the UK, it was very potent in the Brexit campaign. In Austria yesterday with the election. If you, particularly with your background, had the opportunity to sit in front of the European Council and give them, as a collective body, a piece of advice, given that in some cases it's their own careers which may be affected by these issues, is there a piece of advice or an imperative that you would urge on them if you had the opportunity?
Well, the best advice I can give them isn't very helpful, which is that it's better to tackle a problem before it gets big. And I don't just say that to duck the question, but in 2013, there was a small number of refugees fleeing the Middle East and going to Europe. And in 2014, still relatively small, although about 2,500 died on the way. But the European Council missed a massive opportunity then to try and put in place the systems for distributing refugees around Europe, processing the cases. And it then paid the price in 2015 when you had this massive pent-up demand. Given where Europe is today, and the locus of refugee flows shifted from the Middle East now to North Africa, I think it's obviously very, very difficult, but some things immediately become necessary. Europe does need a system for tracking everyone who comes in and everyone who goes out. It's called the entry-exit system, and those, by the way, who are refused entry. And that has now been established, because if your own population think you're not able to control your borders, then you're in trouble. The second thing is, I do think if you don't offer people a legal route to hope, they will seek an illegal route. And so a proper refugee resettlement route is important. And we've calculated that if the UN says there are 1.2 million refugees who are the most vulnerable, who need resettlement, and Europe's share, we've calculated, is about 540,000 over 5 years. So I think a refugee resettlement route, that was the European Parliament vote that I was referring to. Third, Europe's got to get much better at processing asylum claims. There's still 40,000 people in Greece waiting for their asylum claims to get processed, which is a nightmare. Some of them have been there now for 18 months or 2 years. And it's a nightmare for them, but it's also a nightmare for the policymakers. The fourth thing, don't worry, there aren't sort of 14 points on this list, but the fourth thing is that a problem shared can be a problem solved. And Europe has to insist that if it's going to remain the case that people have to claim asylum in the country to which they first land, which is more or less Greece and Italy, those countries don't just need help in processing the cases, but successful cases need to be distributed around Europe. It's called a relocation scheme. And if countries aren't willing to accept relocated refugees, then they have to pay for them to create some kind of incentive system. So I don't pretend at all that that is an easy answer. The biggest problem, obviously, is that you've got a massive flow of people through North Africa. Libya is in an impossible state, and you've got unspeakable conditions for people who've made the journey. We've got a team of about 300 in Libya, and we've got people down the route through Niger and down as far south as Sierra Leone and West Africa. And there's no question that the old migration routes that used to take people to Libya for work and then back down from North Africa and into Central Africa, the word has not got out about the state of the danger to people in Libya. And I think we're doing a humanitarian duty, actually, by explaining to people further south what's going on there.
I think we have time for one more question. Sir.
You haven't mentioned the word race. How much does racism and xenophobia affect this whole issue, especially in the US and Europe?
Well, I think that in the US, my perspective as someone who's living and working here is that, frankly, it's been less a race issue than a religious issue in respect of refugees. I mean, the demonization of Muslim refugees and the equation of the word refugee with the word terrorist is what struck me about the debate here over the last few years. I mean, President Trump talks about a Trojan horse that's coming from Syria, and that's speaking very directly to, and he says, you know, these people are a quote-unquote threat to you and your family. And I think that is, it feels like it's playing off a deep fear of what Muslim refugees might represent and might portend, in defiance of this extraordinary example of, you know, this is a country where 3,500 Muslims in the American Armed Forces, and you know the story well about contributions that different races and religions have played to this country. You might be able to advise me about the extent to which the categorization stroke demonization of undocumented immigrants has a racial, as distinct from a religious component. But maybe to end on a note that will stop everyone just going out and sort of drowning their sorrows. People often say to me, what's it like to lead a humanitarian agency, a refugee resettlement agency, at a time of backlash against them? And I always say, look, the most important thing to understand about working in this country is that for every person who's afraid of a refugee, there's someone else who wants to say, hang on, my family's got refugees in it, my neighbor's a refugee, my workmate's a refugee. It's part of the identity of this country to stand up for people who are fleeing from persecution. And we've found, you know, there was a terrible case of the FBI intercepted an attempt to blow up an apartment block in Kansas that was a refugee apartment block. And there have been Facebook posts and calls to our offices that have been full of vengefulness and hatred. But actually, for every one of those, there's another group of people who want to stand up and say, hang on, we want to welcome these people to our communities. And it's not as simple as big city, small city. It's not as simple as coastal versus... In Midland, Texas, we've got an office where refugees are being welcomed. In Boise, Idaho, refugees are being welcomed, as well as in New York and LA. And we don't actually do refugee resettlement in Chicago. It's done by the Catholic Resettlement Agency. So I think that it's important to those of you who've got a voice as citizens or as residents, there are other people like you. It doesn't need to feel like you're just on the receiving end of the backlash.
Okay, thank you. So to close the events.
Thank you. I'm Daniel Diem. I'm the provost of the University of Chicago. First of all, I want to thank you, David, very much for joining us here today. It was a privilege to have you and for hear your thoughts about this important policy topic today. It was in 2015, right after the main influx of refugees happened in Europe when we announced the creation of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Evolution of Global Conflict. And many people at that event remarked that the refugee crisis was arguably the most important foreign policy challenge of our time. Sadly, we're not in a position today to say that this situation is any less serious and any less dire. David's work and the work of the International Rescue Committee globally is inspiring and much needed. We appreciate your insights and the energy that you brought to the university today and the critical work that you're leading today around the world. I'm hopeful that through this talk, our University of Chicago students will be motivated to find solutions to the significant challenges that we've been discussing. I also like to extend a special thanks to David Axelrod and the Institute of Politics, and James Robinson and the Institute and the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts for coordinating today's event. These two institutes are emblematic of what we value at the University of Chicago. Each, in their own way, seeks to challenge conventional wisdom, facilitate debate and dialogue, and inspire the next generation of leaders to make a difference. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you again, David Miliband, for your important work and for spending the afternoon with us. Thank you.